There are many various flaws and problems with both communism and anarchism. However, YouTube seemed to be lacking in videos elaborating on them. You can find one or two short ones, few debates, but that's basically it. Trying to find information about communism on YouTube mostly results in many videos defending it, and more being ambiguously vague about it. It is somewhat understandable that channels which like to educate their audiences about various philosophies try their best to be as unbiased as possible. Still, even they usually don't have such neutral opinion about fascism. Young people of present generation weren't as exposed to the Cold War rhetorics, and to most of them communism seems like that old ideology of previous century. Still, due to their lack of knowledge, they are more easily swayed by modern communists. To that we have to add the fact that people discontent with their present life and the state of the world like to look for political alternatives. All these factors and more create an environment very friendly for communist resurgence. Interest in anarchistic communism, unlike historical collectivist communism, is additionally compounded by the fact that it was never properly enacted on big scale, which makes many people wonder about organizing society according to these precepts. It is my desire to tell you about 10 arguments in no particular order why we should not try to create a communist society. Government helps poor more than harms. According to Marx, state is merely a tool of the rich. Politicians are always subservient to the bourgeois. He believed that since it was unwieldy and risky for capitalists to run society directly, they preferred to rule from the shadows. That way poor people would be confused about who their supposedly real enemy is. He believed that this mode of shadow government had its roots in early merchant republics, which is ironic, given that Kropotkin seems to consider them ideal example of anarchistic communism. In his lectures titled, "The State, Its Historic Role," assumption of powerless state was important in establishing the absolute necessity of revolution. While Kropotkin was more concerned that small changes wouldn't work and therefore sudden big changes were necessary, Marx preferred to root his ideal of revolution in duality of social struggle. To him, state was just an obsolete complication, creation and servant of the rich, an extension of their will. All that mattered were the exploited class and class of exploiters. However, even during his life he was capable of seeing examples of government striking at the rich when it was beneficent to the ruling class. More so, the improvements in labor conditions like 8-hour-long workdays, safety measures and minimal wages also showed that workers could pressure political elites to restrict rich for them. It seems that no revolution is necessary, and government is indeed effective intermediary between social classes. However, educated public is necessary requirement for such changes. As we know, oil barons and many other industries put great funds in lobbying to sway public opinion into supporting them. Republican propaganda is basically built on convincing working class that they don't want what they want, and that the biggest threat to their well-being comes from migrants, and more importantly to our case tax rises. As if only blacks would benefit from welfare programs and minimum wages. Revolutionary dictatorships refuse dissolution into utopias. Step 1. Abolish present government through revolution. Step 2. Establish dictatorship of the masses to oversee redistribution of wealth from the rich to all the needy. Step 3. Dissolve the state altogether, so that classless and stateless society could exist. That is general script compass by Marx as to how capitalist societies ought to evolve into socialist ones. Dictatorship of the proletariat is supposed to be absolutely necessary transitory period. Looking back, it is a shame that nobody asked Engels or Marx about how much, on average, that transitory period should last. Soviet Union lasted for 69 years, and still it were not enough. The dictatorship of the proletariat had a lot of time there and in other historical communist states to dissolve after it became obsolete, but apparently such things never happen. There is no step 3, there is no happy ending, and there is no promised fruit of the revolution. People who does not accept these supposedly transitory periods as real communism have to accept that their real communism is unachievable, because all attempts result in endlessly delayed transitory phases. The only possible revolution is a permanent one. Delusional pacifism. It might be very surprising to many given that we know what happens when communism or anarchism is instituted, but both movements have strong pacifistic desires. Anarchists like to use an excuse that things are getting violent with them only because they are provoked, and after October Revolution, Trotsky was even naive enough to base Soviets' defense of Soviet Union on the assumption that if they would not fight back, the spirit of German soldiers would be revolted against easy land grabs of their generals. Pacifistic movements are ultimately a good thing. War should be avoided whenever possible, and when a war already begun, manifestations can be very helpful in swaying ruling class into engaging it quicker. Such initiatives are greatly admirable. However, what is not so admirable is pressing the government to abolish military. Ideally, competent armies should exist and be used only in defense. Without a population of the state is left without protection to external powers. Marx had always hoped that successful revolution in one state would automatically arouse successful communist revolutions in other states, therefore whole world would be converted in one swing. That way communism would accordingly to his wishes, end all wars. However, as we know, workers of the world did not unite, and Soviet Republic had to invent Stalinist idea of communism in one country, in order to deal with that reality. They were very much aware that in their grim situation, they had to have military as everyone else. Such are sad realities of international existence. If you can't defend yourself, you will be exploited by foreign powers keen on world domination. Leo Tolstoy's dreams remain unachievable. Anarchism always leads to violence. Kropotkin saw several forms of former organization of social life as very good and used as examples for future communist societies. Among these were previously mentioned merchant republics, which due to the bad ring to that name, were renamed by him as free cities, since that sounds much better for his agenda. He praised old craftsman guild system, and sometimes spent quite a deal of time on establishing that guilds removed during French Revolution were just a shadow of their former perfectly egalitarian glory. Despite his pacifism, he excused all the military conflicts that were wrought by merchant republics, by saying that people who fought in these conflicts were fighting for their own essential interests, rather than being assimilated into colorless, lifeless whole. On one hand, he likes to claim that wars were fruit of state oppression, or just a matter of petty bourgeois interests, but on the other, he had to find a way to justify violence, due to necessarily violent nature of revolution. His musings on merchant republics show interesting truth, that ultimately all that differentiation is just a clumsy hand wave to dismiss criticism, especially since his beloved free cities were still basically small states, and besides, technological differences being drafted into an army weren't really that different from what came to be the norm in later modern era. While merchant republics initially liked to use mercenaries who fought battles with low casualties that changed in later periods due to their ineffectiveness. He liked to excuse his comrades from being violent at all, also using a false argument that anarchists aren't prone to violence by themselves, and that they were always forced to violence due to societies being hostile to them. After October Revolution, the only reason for which he was critical of Bolsheviks were that their form of governance were too centrally organized. Modern excuses for violence aren't really all that different, although most people at least try to use a just cause as justification, like with propaganda of the deed, but it is indeed amusing how easy it is to twist our minds to our ideological needs. When one views simple fact that somebody else is rich as an act of violence, it is easy to justify a lot of atrocities in the name of self-defense. It is especially hypocritical when taken into context of previous point about pacifism. Communists and anarchist modes of self-governance necessarily lead to authoritarianism. Another historical form of human organization that Kropotkin was a great fan of were peasant communes. Due to communist influences after February Revolution, Russians tried that system on a large scale even before Lenin even came to the country. In his April theses, he condemned provisional government and wanted all power to belong to these so-called Soviets. Soviets weren't created due to any internal directive coming from the then deposed Tsar, nor from the provisional government that tried to officially replace him. It weren't Lenin's directive to establish them at all. Soviets weren't destroyed by provisional government. Both them and provisional government hold some power, and many contemporary intellectuals agreed that it was in the Soviet councils that the true power lied in Russia. Soviets, that is worker councils, were supposed to help people in directly controlling their lives through communal decision-making, based on outdated institutions like Mir. These Soviets contributed to creation of democratic centralism, ruled by people through one-party rule without any legal opposition, since opposition to the will of the people represented by the party could not be allowed. Small self-governing units composed of individuals with intimate understanding of their life matters over which they are making decisions are the communist ideal, but in reality all such small free collections of people quickly create higher-level units residing over them, and these create newer ones to preside over them, and so Soviets turned into subservient organs of greater centralized authoritarian power. Attempts at direct democracy in cities are always bound to turn into exploitable bureaucracies. Even when different forms of government were enacted by communists in other countries, charismatic authoritarians saw these power shifts as an occasion for benefiting their selfish interests. The only sort of social environment in which such processes is not happening are small collectives like Freetown Christina, or other small social experiments established in harsh places like Amazon forest or far Siberia. Small scale of such communities motivate ambitious people to see power elsewhere. Political specialization. We can see the process mentioned in previous point happening before our eyes in modern world. Natalie Wynn might have been a taxi driver in the past, part of the whiter working class, a person in a direct touch with lower class problems. However, as she became more and more successful, she became professional leftist, a person who maintains themselves from their ideological creations. She's obviously still working, but so do politicians, and hers life is no longer similar to the lives of hers followers. She no longer have to be worried about paying her rent, being fired, not having money for medical treatment and the like. Instead, she has new problems like being cancelled, or not having ideas for new videos, problems which only few leads share with her. Just look how easy it is to forget how it is to be a child, and you'll understand that harsh beginnings doesn't guarantee being in touch with everyday realities of common life. Anarchistic communism puts emphasis on grassroots movements and people discussing and deciding their interests at lowest levels, but over time leaders naturally emerge, and these leaders occupy privileged positions as governors and influencers. Then they no longer have a need for doing physical labor necessary for maintaining society, since that would waste their time, as they are thought to be made for more important tasks concerning leadership of society. In his conquest of bread, Kropotkin even allows people to work twice as much, so that other person could not work at all, if they would have some special talent. It might have been that many political idols were born in poor working class families, but as they ascend to the top they start to forget about these old harsh realities as their life conditions are changing with their social position. There is really no way around that. Even though sometimes some communist thinkers were personally involved in manual labor, they still had other social privileges. Even when those privileges weren't institutionalized, they still existed through their sheer personal authority over other people. Respected individuals naturally appear in society, and while some might argue that these positions are deserved as long as they were earned rather than inherited, that doesn't change the fact that population is divided into leaders and led, and that very easily and very quickly turns into exploited and exploiters without either noticing anything. In order for anarchistic communist utopias to be realized, people must make decisions based on their living experiences, but that is impossible when influencers and ideologues are enshrined by the masses. Due to natural social mechanics, individuals surrender themselves to the will of the group in order to live together, but likewise groups like to choose individuals with charisma or intellect to influence them, and therefore by proxy of group people have to surrender themselves to other people. Then when these influential individuals have disagreements between themselves, their followers also come to pauses, increasing hostility towards each other. That fuels tribalist instincts in human beings, and society becomes divided, not because life interests are at conflict, but rather because charismatic people have disagreements. These were frequently causes for wars between medieval and ancient monarchs. We can observe that phenomenon in liberal societies as well, but there are norms and laws dictated by the state which protect these personal animosities between elites from affecting common people in dire ways. On the other hand, anarchist societies lack these protections, and communist societies had to turn authoritarian in order to hold people together. Accountability. In his famous conquest of bread, Kropotkin presents society offering everything for free to be taken according to one's needs. In order to produce such necessities, every person would have to work 5 hours per day. In the case of lazy person, community would pressure that individual into either leaving or getting to work. At the end of one sub-chapter he presents a quote which could be said to a person refusing to work. It is a proposition to find a suitable job that you can perform, and in the case you are unwilling you will certainly be punished, but not by police, state or judges, but rather by people who would not want to maintain idler. Still, that presents a very serious problem of accountability. In a small town, rumor will spread fast about who is not working, just like the rumors of romantic affairs, deaths, and births are quickly spreading through such communities. However, in a big city there is no way everybody would know about the work status of the other person. Not to mention, the Kropotkin's right to well-being ensures free distribution of goods. That would naturally eliminate shops and cashiers as we know it. Still, food and other utilities would have to be transported to a place from where people would take it freely. Such places apparently doesn't come with guards, as everybody is supposed to take from them, and it would certainly be against precepts of anarchistic communism if people would have to have some sorts of badges to be checked in order to ensure the goods can be taken. Without government, such official badge system could not be enacted anyways, as it would be rather easy to counterfeit them, hard to take them away from people who already got them and then stopped working, and all that without police force nor citizen listings. Right to free association without supervision leads to organized crime. The next argument comes from the previous. Since everybody can be idle, since nobody is getting better by working, so it is impossible to take track of sneaky evildoers. We could assume, just for the sake of the argument, that people indeed manage to deal economically with the unsolvable problems of anarchistic communism, and then we can look at a very interesting passage from the Conquest of Bread. It is ending of the quote mentioned in previous point.
And lastly, if it does not please you, go and look for other conditions elsewhere in the wide world. Always seek adherence and organize with them on novel principles. We prefer our own.
It's supposed to be an expression of freedom, a declaration that while people living in anarchistic societies have to work for the well-being of everybody, they are still free beings which can go live in capitalist states, or they can figure out something else on their own, if they have some cool ideas Kropotkin could not figure out. Still, when I read that passage I had one idea in mind. Say for example, that you would not want to work, and you would prefer to take fruits of work from others. Others would probably defeat you, because you are alone, and it's hard to control several people. However, you probably aren't alone. There quite probably are other folk like you who would like to live at the expense of others. You could just band together, and organize yourself on, not that novel principles. You probably would start in low population density rural areas. Maybe you would just rob folk, and then go into hiding like medieval bandits, protecting yourself from the lords from which you were stealing by proxy of stealing from their peasants. You could try to have some small slave society, if you were to have weaponry, and training you and your men could recreate together some small state. They would follow you, because they would also get a lot of free stuff from all the people you would subjugate together. Kropotkin correctly notices that in a functioning anarchistic society, which might I remind you is not possible, but as I said, let's assume it is, if a wealthy capitalist would come to it and offer people wages they would probably refuse, because full value of their labor is more precious than value diminished by profit. That utopian anarchism would not turn into capitalism that way, but it still could turn into feudalism in much the same way it initially did. When conquerors were settling in their new lands, they were privileged with power, so that they became higher class, while conquered people had lower status, and were employed as labor force. When feudalism reached its more advanced stages, it weren't going as smoothly, but the general pattern is the same. One could argue that such primal feudalization could not happen again in the same way due to an often overlooked fruit of industrial revolution, urbanization. Cities are dense population centers, so they were always harder to control than similarly big area of farming fields. Peasants turned into workers. Could such violent evil takeovers be done in a city? Even more so, city, unlike open fields, even unlike forest, is full of hiding places. It's hard to tell what's going on in big apartments. You can never know if person living just above you or just below you have several skeletons in their closet, or maybe billions of dollars in cash, or maybe secret home drug cultivation going on. People could be silenced with threats, as to not tell their neighbors and family about being exploited, just like nowadays we can be scared into not bringing crimes to the authorities. Population swift from villages to cities changed a lot in our society, but in many regards it haven't changed anything at all. Limited access to basic goods. Most people will agree that food, clothing and shelter are the most basic human needs. We have to exclude procreation, urination, breathing and the like here, since these doesn't have that much to do with economical forces, maybe save for the first. As we know from the historical data, famines were pretty common during communist regimes like Great Ukrainian Famine, or the famine during Great Leap Forward in China, which occurred despite good weather. Bolsheviks promised peace, bread and land to all, yet they hardly delivered on them. Supposedly selfish people who wanted to save themselves by hiding grain from others in order to ensure their survival were dealt with harshly, including death penalty, because they were considered greedy hoarders. According to scar literature written by survivors of Chinese Revolution, tree bark was frequently eaten under Mao. Still, for the most part of USSR history, people weren't starving enough to completely die out. Same goes to NRD and some other states. However, in these times, and in these societies, we can see importance of other things, which leads us to limited access to finer goods. Before Western Berlin was blocked, many Germans from Eastern side were coming there for entertainment. They were longing to possess riches of the Western Bloc, and that was one of the major factors in Stalin's decision to issue a blockade on Western Berlin. When USSR dissolved, one of the things that Russians wanted were Western products, Western media, Western clothing and Western food. That historical evidence provokes frequent criticisms. Thought Slime once felt obliged to respond that, when people say that capitalism makes smartphones, he think it is the people, not capitalism, who make the smartphones, and anarchistic communism cares about these people. He claims that under different mode of production, Western products would still be made with similar quality, because the same people would do it the same way, but they would be treated better. Still, it is an interesting intellectual dodge by which people try to escape from the historical evidence in the form of fulfilled cravings of millions of people. When the Eastern Bloc fell, even though he could not see the future, Kropotkin correctly assumed that, while providing basic goods is of greatest importance, people want finer goods. So in order to make his visions attractive, he tried to figure a way how such needs could be fulfilled in anarchistic society. According to him, in their leisure, people could make their own luxury goods in association with other people sharing their interests. To him, people who would like to read books would have to be part of printing association of writers and printers, so that they could help in production. If you were a musician and wanted a piano, you would enroll in piano crafting group. It is already a ridiculous vision from the point of view of late 19th century, but try to imagine gamers enrolling in gamer associations in which they would be producing game consoles, or smartphones, or even computers. Reading Peter Kropotkin is like reading a better, less dumb version of Thought Slime, and sometimes I wonder why he's not bringing up something from his master's works. But this one time I was perfectly certain that he had to be aware of how badly aged that particular idea was. So that would conclude this video. See you next time.